Well, good morning, everybody. This is Barry Jones with sphistory.com, and we are beginning episode 12 today, the Miami series. And I'm going to attempt to tie all this up in a knot or a bow and conclude this series. I should stipulate right from the get-go, I could go on and on and on, probably do 10 more episodes, but I'm going to try to restrain myself and let's tie it up today. And so that's where we're headed. And then the next mini series, which will just be 2 episodes, will discuss the mole in Miami, which prevented the assassination from happening in Miami, because all of this is about Miami being the epicenter and all things being equal. If the conspirators, the main conspirators of the assassination, had their way, uh, they would have carried out the assassination in Miami. And there were 2 plots, November 18th, 4 days before he was actually killed in Dallas, to do just that. They just didn't succeed. And we're going to talk about why they didn't succeed and how these conspirators learned lessons from prior assassination plots that they were able to put into place to prevent anyone from sabotaging their plans in Dallas. But what happened in Dallas was originally scheduled, planned to happen elsewhere, and even before Miami, there were other locations prior to Miami. So far as my research has shown me to this point, anyway, and that could always change, it was the only city that had 2 such plots, and neither one of them succeeded. So we'll get into that in the subsequent mini-series. But today we're going to finish up what we've been talking about, and that is Miami is the conspiracy town, and it is uh, basically home to this industry, this covert industry to assassinate first Castro and then later Kennedy. And what we've come through to this point is a whole, in episodes 1 through 5, I tried to uh, illustrate all the different people and the groups that they represented that are headquartered in Miami, all having the same motive for different reasons, but all having the same ultimate motive, which is to assassinate Castro and or get him and his government out of power in Cuba. And if you remember, those were the Cuban exiles, and it was the mob, and it was CIA. And then in episodes 6, subsequent episodes 6 through 11, we talked about the different operations that have been ongoing, all coming from Miami in an effort to do just that. And we started off with Operation 40, which was Nixon's brainchild. He was vice president. Kennedy inherited it. Of course, the big operation that involved Operation 40 and all the paramilitaries that had been trained by the CIA was the Bay of Pigs. And that happened April of 61. So Kennedy's only been president 3 months. He inherited that whole operation. Of course, it went bad. And publicly, Kennedy took the blame for it. CIA and the Cubans, the mob, they all blamed Kennedy for not calling in additional air support. Privately, he blamed the CIA and turned into a war between the White House and the CIA going forward. And but in order to, because he's only been president 3 months, trying to show the American people and all the people that he'd made promises during the campaign that he was resolute and still determined to carry through with the cause, he doubled down on Operation 40, changing the name to Operation Mongoose, trying to deceive Khrushchev and keep the people close here in the United States happy with him. So he's making decisions, I think, with politics in mind early on in his presidential tenure. And uh, then we get into the creation of the S Force, which actually took place before Kennedy even became president. But it was being, and again, this is something that Kennedy inherited, didn't know anything about it. When he came to the presidency, the CIA briefed him on Operation 40 and all the anti-Castro covert operations, not all of them, but most of them. But it did not brief him on the existence of the S force. He had no idea that was happening. Of course, he had no idea there was another assassination program called Executive Action that was taking place, and the American people didn't find out about that until the 70s, or the church hearings. Anyway, the decision was made after Bay of Pigs to double down on Operation 40, changed the name to Operation Mongoose, and run it all out of the Miami CIA station, JM Wave. And this would be run by his brother Bobby. And because he's got this war going on, the CIA fires the top three guys. He takes away a lot of their power with the Executive Act, National Security Action Memos 55, 56, 57, strips a lot of their financing away, and puts his brother in charge of the new operation going forward. And so he keeps making these promises to carry on with the anti-Castro crusade. Well, Khrushchev is noticing this, and so he and Castro decide it's best to repel a future invasion, since Kennedy's lied to him, by putting missiles, armed forces and missiles on the island of Cuba. And of course, this leads to the Cuban Missile Crisis in 62. So in 61, you've got Bay of Pigs, which is a disaster. 62, you got the Cuban Missile Crisis, which these same forces now believe is God smiling on Kennedy and giving him a second chance to make right what he did wrong the first time, to do over. So they all advise the same thing: invade the island or bomb the missile sites, whichever. But whatever we do is going to, obviously, it's going to lead to a war between us and Cuba, and probably the Soviets as well. And that's fine. That's what they want. But of course, that's not what Kennedy wants. And so he and Bobby start, stalling for time, and they come up with this idea of a quarantine. And meanwhile, a back channel is established between him and Khrushchev, whereby the two leaders start talking to one another through emissaries, intermediaries. They realize that they both are seeking a peaceful exit to this problem, and they both are being pressured by hardline elements in their own government. And it's going to be up to them to stand up to those hardline elements and somehow save face for both of them, so both can claim victory after it's over, and remain in power. And so we went on for a long time about that, and how Kennedy ends up getting publicly the credit for standing up to Khrushchev and forcing him to remove the missiles, but privately, Khrushchev gets Kennedy to accept two conditions: A, a promise never to invade Cuba again. This time he has to mean it. And B, you have to remove your missiles from Italy and Turkey, like a quid pro quo. Well, I'll remove my missiles from Cuba. You got to remove your missiles from Italy and Turkey. And so, though publicly Kennedy is viewed as a hero back home, privately all the folks in the know that he got the worst end of the deal, and they start leaking that. The CIA knows that their operations are being shut down afterwards, because Kennedy is sending the customs officials and marshals down to close down all the Operation Now they were originally called Operation 40 bases. Now they're called Operation Mongoose bases. He's shutting them all down, and he's arresting the liaisons, the CIA liaisons that won't comply. E. Howard Hunt, Frank Sturgis. So they realize, Kennedy's his policy towards Cuba has changed as a result of the Cuban Missile Crisis. So they start leaking that to all their Cuban contacts in Miami, mafia as well. Meanwhile, the military is aware that policy has changed, because they're being ordered to remove missiles from Italy and Turkey. And so all of the forces that had been aligned against Castro are now taking stock and realizing the real problem is not with Castro, or at least he's still a problem, but they're never going to be able to take out Castro as long as Kennedy's around. And this is about the time they go to him with this Operation Northwoods idea, and he laughs at that, calls him crazy. But the whole idea was to launch terrorist attacks against American targets, even on American soil, and and up to and including casualties, even if you have to fake the casualties, get lots of news coverage and create a patsy or a false flag situation where you blame for these terrorist attacks Cuba. And if you can put the blame and if you can cause enough havoc and enough terrorist attacks to raise the ire of the American people, it will justify an invasion of Cuba and the war that they always wanted. And of course, he vetoes that, but they don't give up on the idea, as we find out a year later in Dallas. But so then the final betrayal or betrayals to these conspirators is the idea that the back channel between him and Khrushchev has continued even after uh, the conclusion of the Cuban Missile Crisis. And now they're negotiating a test ban, a nuclear test ban treaty, whereby at this point in time in history, we had the advantage as far as nuclear weapons are concerned. And these military joint chiefs, Pentagon officials believe this is an act of treason on Kennedy's part. He's giving away our advantage. Meanwhile, he's also established a back channel with Castro. And through William Atwood and Susan, uh, Lisa Howard, he's talking with Castro about normalizing relations with Cuba. And of course, the CIA knows about this because they've bugged Atwood's phones and Howard's phones. So they know. So again, they're leaking this. So the answer to this question, what is the source of the anti-Castroites' bitter hatred for JFK, is that he's made these promises. You know, early on in my coaching career, I got some advice from my boss. He told me, when you're talking to the parents, when you're talking to the media or whatever, promise little, deliver much. Don't overpromise. You're just starting your career. You're inheriting nothing because there was, in my first job, there was no team. There was no program. We were creating a new high school out of nothing. So we were starting a brand new program. We had some things working against us. He says, it's going to be a slow build. So promise little, deliver much. You won't have to deal with the anger and disappointment of overpromising. There's some pretty good advice I got from my boss. Kennedy did just the opposite. He comes into the White House promising much, but after 3 years, he's delivered little. In his 1960 campaign, he promised the anti-Castro Cubans, the anti-Castroite community down in Miami, that he, along with them, was committed to the cause of overthrowing Castro. I mean, he made that a point of his campaign. In fact, in his debates with Nixon, he accused Nixon and Eisenhower of not doing enough to get rid of Castro. So it's pretty clear he was saying, I'm going to do more. And of course, we find out later he's made promises through his father in exchange for help from the organized crime figures to get him across the finish line to beat Nixon, that he will, once elected, get the organized crime back into Cuba, which means he's going to have to get rid of Castro. So he's made promises. The CIA cast their lots with Kennedy in the campaign because they lied to him. They couldn't lie to Nixon, though they had Nixon in their pocket, and Nixon had been privy to all their covert operations because he'd been over them. They couldn't lie to him because he knew where all the bodies were buried, but they could lie to Kennedy. So in their thinking, Nixon is incredibly useful because he's on our side. He's the one sort of directing all these covert ops during the 50s. But Kennedy could be more on our side because he's a blank slate. We can basically create a Manchurian candidate out of him. He can just be whatever we want him to be. We can lie to the guy. He won't know no better. He just repeats the lie. So they thought, well, as far as manipulation is concerned going forward, nobody knows the future. But we'd rather have a president that we can control completely than one that we can't control. And so so he's made all these promises, and he's become like this vehicle of hope for some pretty angry, motivated, committed, passionate people. And as long as he's delivering on that, or at least it appears that he's delivering on it, working in that direction. All of that anger and all that motivation, all that passion is behind him, working for him. If he ever betrays the cause, all of that anger and hostility, all that motivation, all that passion will turn on a dime and work against him. That's the problem with overpromising. And of course, early on, he delivered. He reauthorized Operation 40 to continue. He authorized Bay of Pigs to happen based on the intel the CIA gave him, the promises. He doubled down after Bay of Pigs failed. At least he doubled down and said, okay, we're going to continue with this. Change the name from Operation 40 to Operation Mongoose. But if you're in this cabal of anti-Castroites, you're a Cuban exile, or you're in organized crime, or you're in the CIA, at least you can make the argument, okay, Bay of Pigs was his mulligan. He messed up. He's a young president. He doesn't know what he doesn't know. But at least he's realized the error of his way, and he's going to continue in this effort. So they can at least make an argument to continue to support him. And then in late 62, even after the Cuban Missile Crisis, he's still promising, trying to keep hope alive down in Miami. Goes down to the Orange Bowl, makes that promise that he knows he can't keep. He's already made the opposite promise to Khrushchev twice. Now, this time he intends to fulfill it. Meanwhile, he's making another promise to the folks in Miami, which they know at the time he's saying those words that he didn't mean it, because the leakers from the CIA have let them know that he's secretly back-channeling with Castro, trying to find a peaceful solution. So he's promised all these things. Initially, it looked like there was hope that he would come through with those, but one by one, he's betrayed their cause. And you just add up the betrayals, right? The Bay of Pigs was a disaster in their way of thinking. And when I say they, I'm talking about the three conspirators. In their way of thinking, it was his screw up. It's his fault. He didn't give them the air support they asked for. Of course, it was their fault. They didn't get all 10 planes, right? They got 7 of them. But they told him, the other 3 won't be a problem. Turned out the other 3 were a problem. Then in the Cuban Missile Crisis, instead of treating it like a do-over opportunity to fix what he got wrong in Bay of Pigs, he doesn't invade. He doesn't bomb the missile sites. And then on the heels of the Cuban Missile Crisis, he makes this promise to Khrushchev that this time he intends to keep. And then Operation Mongoose, which got everybody's hopes up, now is being shut down. He's sending the marshals and the customs officials down. He's seizing the C4 and the explosives and the ammo. He's arresting the leaders of these bases that won't go along. And now he's secretly negotiating with Castro to normalize relations. I mean, the old expression, fool me once, shame on me, or you, fool me twice, shame on me. And he has betrayed the cause more than twice. And so as I mentioned, the anger and the hostility, the motivation, the passion, all that stuff was bottled up, ready to explode in Miami at any point in time, is now turned, and all of the training that the Kennedy government has participated in to train these paramilitaries, that the U.S. government has been training the US force to assassinate a moving target from distance with high-powered rifles and scopes, using triangulation of fire. Now all that expertise and all that passion, instead of being aimed at Castro, now it's being aimed at Kennedy. Just to give you some anecdotal little pieces of evidence, Ruben Carvajal, who was a friend of David Morales, and we've talked about him before, he was involved with Morales, all the different CIA operations against Castro that Morales was. And of course, Morales was the CIA's best assassin. He was the guy. He was the one you call to do the job nobody else could do. And so this is his friend, Ruben Carvajal. And in a 2004 interview with David Talbot, Carvajal said, quote, President Kennedy screwed up, caused all those deaths at the Bay of Pigs. He pulls off the planes. The men get caught on the ground. You want me to respect a president like that? Or an asshole like his brother? I mean, this shows how the worm turned. They initially supported Kennedy, but Bay of Pigs was almost, it wasn't the turning point, but it was the beginning of the turning point. And when push comes to shove and you start looking back after the assassination and you ask these people, what was the turning point or where did you start to doubt? They all go back to Bay of Pigs. And then you're kind of 50-50 at that point. And then you have these subsequent betrayals and it pushes everybody into the opposite camp. Um, Another one of these militant Cubans, Homer Echevarria, a Cuban exile leader who was negotiating an illegal weapons purchase on November 21st, 1963. He was in Dallas, by the way. According to Chauncey Holt, Chauncey Holt made a drop in Homer Echevarria's, I think it was a station wagon, right there in the parking lot behind Dealey Plaza, right there behind the picket fence. He was in Dallas on that day, but on the 21st, he was overheard by a Secret Service informant named Thomas Mosley. In fact, it wasn't overheard. He was actually talking to Thomas Mosley. He said, quote, as they were negotiating this weapons purchase, he says, quote, we will have plenty of money to finish the deal as soon as we take care of Kennedy. In other words, he's buying weapons for the anti-Castro cause that's still ongoing, even though Kennedy has shut it down. And it has to be secret now. And so he's buying these weapons. And he's saying to Mosley, here, we'll have the money for you. You get the weapons, we'll have the money for you as soon as we take care of Kennedy. In other words, they're expecting an influx of cash. And what they've, what this implies is that these folks that had been doing the dirty work for the CIA, for these conspirators, for this whole conspiracy to kill Castro, are now turned doing the dirty work to get rid of Kennedy, and will get paid handsomely for that, from which they can take that a portion of those proceeds and use it to continue the anti-Castro cause. When Mosley asked about where the money's going to come from, according to Echevarria, it was coming from mafia money. So here you have two, just in this little story, this little anecdote, you have three conspirators having a conversation. I did a whole series of videos on the Secret Service and their role in the JFK assassination. There's no question in my mind the Secret Service was involved in the conspiracy. They were one of the five conspirators. Two of the others were Cubans and mafia. So here we are. We've got a Cuban talking to a Secret Service guy saying he's getting money from the mafia. Oh, there's three of the conspirators right there. After the assassination, the Secret Service planned to investigate Echevarria, too little too late, and the Cubans, but the probe was shut down by the FBI. Boy, this is huge right here. The FBI was the collector of all the evidence in the JFK case, and then it would forward it on to the Warren Commission, 63, 64. And of course, within minutes of the shooting, J. Edgar Hoover has already decided how this was going to go. He's already decided who was at fault. He's announced to the American people, he's announced to the new president that it was a lone assassin. It was Lee Harvey Oswald. And of course, we now know that he knew in advance that this was going to happen because of the written warning that he got from Richard Case Nagel. So he knew in advance what was fixing to happen. And it was a conspiracy. It involved the CIA, it involved the government. He let it happen, and then he shut down any alternative explanation or areas of investigation afterwards and focused all the energies in one direction. That was Lee Harvey Oswald. J. Edgar Hoover is key to this conspiracy working. And of course, who's his best friend? Who did he live next to in Washington, D.C. for all these years? Who appointed him FBI director for life after the JFK assassination? This is LBJ, another one of the conspirators. So it's all very incestuous. So here we see that there's threats being made prior to the assassination. You can see the state of mind of these folks. Nestor Castellanos, another anti-Castrite, vehemently blamed JFK for the U.S. government's policy, what he called non-interference in Cuba. What he detected over time as Kennedy's presidency went from 1 year to 2 to 3 was that Kennedy was just stringing everybody along. And he had adopted a policy of non-interference while at the same time making all these promises that he couldn't keep. The House Select Committee discovered evidence that an undercover agent witnessed Castellanos tell a meeting of anti-Castro Cubans. This is an undercover CIA agent who witnessed Castellanos tell. So he's standing in front of him and he says, quote, "We're waiting for Kennedy on the 22nd, buddy. We're going to see him in one way or another. We're going to give him the works when he gets to Dallas. Mr. Good old Kennedy. I wouldn't even call him President Kennedy. He stinks." Folks, there are I just referenced Richard Case Nagel's the written warning to the FBI director. There's all kinds of evidence from informants of these anti-Castro Cubans and what they're saying. Others as well. These network of informants the FBI had, the CIA had. There's warnings from and informants about what was going to happen in Chicago. I mean, there's just all kinds of evidence that people in the know knew that this was going to happen before it happened. The whispers in the anti-Castrite community got out. Several documents from the FBI and CIA assassination files more than hint at foreknowledge of the president's assassination. On November 21st, a Cuban told Gregory Basilla, a San Antonio pharmacist, that, quote, "Kennedy will be killed in Dallas tomorrow," which is just one of these random things that later Gregory Basilla went and reported. And he's had a conversation with somebody, a Cuban, and he told him that. An FBI informant told the FBI's Miami office that $25,000 to $50,000 was being offered to anyone who would assassinate the president. In other words, it was a bounty on the president's head. And on early the morning of the 22nd of November, a CIA source in Madrid heard a former Cuban journalist say that, quote, "Kennedy was going to be killed that day." So, I mean, you got people in San Antonio who know, you got people in Madrid who are hearing the same thing. You have FBI informants telling the FBI. You have Richard Case Nagel writing a letter to J. Edgar Hoover. You have these Cubans that are talking to informants that are being reported up the chain. You have Secret Service who know. Everybody knows. It's the worst kept secret in the circles of these conspirators out there. It's one of the reasons why, there's a good series out called "The Men Who Killed Kennedy," and they interview some of these people that were witnessed to be in Dallas on that day. They witness, and they ask them, "Why were you there? Why do you think this guy was there? If you saw him, why do you think this guy?" And one of the guys, and I don't remember his name, said, "Well, there were a lot of rumors going around that something big was going down in Dallas that day. And if you are in that line of work," and it's talking about being an assassin or being somebody in organized crime, somebody who's used to pretty dramatic actions like an assassination, you want to be there and have a front row seat, watch it go down. You want to be able to say that you were there and you saw it. So my point in saying all this is that this was not some big secret that people were not aware of. A lot of people were aware of it, including people that had the power to stop it. I've talked a bit about this guy in the past, Fabian Escalante. I put a lot of stock in what he says in his books because what I've come to, it's interesting. When I first started studying this, all of my sources were U.S. government documents and whatever domestic authorities on this topic had to say. And over the years, I've come to realize they're the ones lying. And I have there's very little credibility left in my mind for anything the U.S. government has to say about the assassination, or anything the history textbooks have to say about the assassination, or anything these so-called experts have to say about the assassination, because they're all lying. And so what I've grown to depend on as time has gone on is more and more is these people don't have any dog in this fight in terms of uh, telling the truth about what happened. Now you have to balance it because obviously Cuba doesn't want to take the blame for the JFK assassination. So you have to balance all of the evidence that you get from a guy like General Fabian Escalante, who was in charge of Cuban state security and was given the assignment by Fidel Castro to investigate the JFK assassination for Cuba and tell him exactly what happened. And, Castro was interested because he was on the verge of a breakthrough with the United States government, with the United States president, which would normalize relations between the two countries and establish his government going forward. He was on the brink. He had a vested interest in Kennedy staying alive. And when Kennedy died, he knew that's it. That was my shot. And I want to know who sabotaged that shot. I want to know who sabotaged, obviously, who killed Kennedy, but who sabotaged any chance of a peaceful relationship between the United States and Cuba. They're all blaming us. If you listen to the United States government, they're putting the blame on us. They're arresting a guy with Cuban ties or who's a Castro sympathizer. They're all blaming us. And so it's obviously this false flag trying to gin up this war. So he goes to his guy and says, you find out what happened. And even if my people are involved, I want to know. I want to know the truth about this. Who's working for me? This is one thing Castro was really good at, was having his ear to the ground and having spies in all the right places. And that spy network had kept him alive during this entire period. Now that spy network is going to help his director of Cuban state security, Fabian Escalante, learn the truth about what really happened. And of course, what we now know is that those spies are inside the very conspiracy. So just as they gave him accurate advice about assassination plots, which kept him alive, now they're going to give him accurate information about the assassination to kill JFK, which is going to help him or his security division guy, Fabian Escalante, this general, write a book and give a report to Fidel that is more truthful, more honest in its assessment of what happened than anything the Warren Commission published. So let's talk about, and of course, he's in a position to know these people because a lot of them came from his country. He knows the names and he knows how they're connected. So the thing that's interesting about what Fabian Escalante did is he names names. The Warren Commission named one name. And then later the House Select Committee said, well, it's probably a conspiracy and we don't really know who. We're thinking it's the mob. But they named some of the mafiosos like Carlos Marcello. They talked about Santos Trafficante and Sam Giancana, maybe Jimmy Hoff. But they couldn't get any more specific. Of course, they never named anybody in the CIA. They never named anybody in the Secret Service. They never named anybody like LBJ. It was always a diversion, somebody else. It wasn't anybody in government. Lord, no. But Fabian Escalante named names. And it's just fascinating how many of these people come from Miami or were based in Miami. Like, for example, Frank Sturgis. And of course, according to Fabian Escalante, he was the scene coordinator. He was sent to Dallas, and he was coming from Miami. And of course, if you remember the story of Marita Lorenz, she was in Miami when she was recruited into this off-the-board, off-the-books operation by Frank Sturgis, and they traveled from Miami to Dallas the day before the assassination with a trunk full of weapons. And he was ensconced in the CIA's GA station in Miami. So he was sent as the scene coordinator. Fabian Escalante suspected that he was in that famous tramp photo, Tramp B, which is included there below, which would be, you see the policeman, you see the first tramp, you see the second, you see the third. According to Fabian, he suspects that Frank Sturgis was tramp number 2 right there in the middle. Now, we now know that wasn't him because of Chauncey Holt But he's sure that Frank Sturgis was one of the men in charge in Dallas that day. He's sure that David Atlee Phillips was another one involved in the plot. These are CIA names. He's naming CIA, and I'll get into other names too. He says that David Atlee Phillips' role was that he led the CIA's Western Hemisphere covert ops, um, and as a specialist in disinformation, primarily his story was, or his role in it was to create the legend of Lee Harvey Oswald being in Mexico City trying to escape to Cuba or the Soviet Union afterwards, plotting with Cuban officials, plotting with Soviet officials on the assassination in advance. According to his investigation, David Atlee Phillips met several times before November 22nd with Lee Harvey Oswald under the code name Maurice Bishop. By the way, that was backed up by Antonio Veciana, who also witnessed David Atlee Phillips meeting with Oswald and knew David Atlee Phillips's alias to be Maurice Bishop. And of course, David Atlee Phillips was an original member of Operation 40, which later became Operation Mongoose. Which was all operating out of Miami. So far, two names from the CIA. The third name was Richard Helms. He was over all of the CIA's anti-Cuban covert ops. So obviously, since it's these same people that are involved in all the anti-Castro stuff that are now responsible for killing the president, he would know because he's over these people. And General Charles Cabal, the former deputy director of the CIA, who had been fired by JFK after Bay of Pigs, he's the brother of Dallas Mayor Earl Cabal. He names him as a conspirator and got his brother to make the change in the motorcade route the night before the assassination. So here is Fabian Escalante naming these guys from the CIA, two of whom are stationed out of Miami. Or one was stationed out of Miami, Frank Sturgis. David Atlee Phillips is stationed out of Mexico City, but he's involved with Operation 40 and later Mongoose, which is running out of Miami. And of course, Richard Helms is over all the anti-Cuban stuff. So those are some of the CIA names. He also names some of the mafia, the mafiosos. Obviously, Santos Trafficante, I've talked a ton about him. And his role in this was he was the organizer of the S-Force. All these paramilitaries were his people. Sam Giancana, another Don of the Chicago crime family, another one of the S-Force organizers. If you remember, they had that big meeting down at the Fontainebleau, and it was these guys. It was Santos, it was Sam, it was Johnny Rosselli, and it was Carlos Marcello. So he names those people that met at the Fontainebleau to organize the S-Force, which originally was aimed at his boss, but eventually killed JFK. And he even names a couple of Cuban exiles who he believes were two of the shooters, Eladio Del Valle and Herminio Diaz. Del Valle from Miami, Diaz from Miami, and he names. So here you have, if you listen to Fabian Escalante, he's naming the names, and they're all coming from the same pool of people that we've been discussing. You've got the CIA pool, you've got the mafia pool, you got the Cuban exile pool, and he's naming all these guys in his report. It's interesting. He had a flow chart, or a diagram to show how all these people were connected. I move my face here. And he shows how these Venn diagrams all intersect. You know, David Morales, who is out the bottom left-hand corner here, in a quote to Shane O'Sullivan for a BBC report, this was actually a quote he made to his lawyer, Robert Walton, who then passed the quote along to Gaten Fonzie and to Shane O'Sullivan. So this is Robert Walton telling these two people, one's an investigator for the House Select Committee, who's writing his own book, The Last Investigation. The other is a reporter doing a report for BBC, Shane O'Sullivan. And according to Robert Walton, David Morales says, quote, I was in Dallas when we got that motherfucker, and I was in L.A. when we got the little bastard. And of course, we already know he was in Chicago because he was arrested along with his spotter, Jim Braden. So David Morales was the CIA top assassin, and he confesses of his own accord that he was in two of the three places where there were assassination plots against a Kennedy. And of course, we know he didn't confess to Chicago, but we know he was in Chicago because he was arrested and interrogated. And Abraham Bolden testified that he was one of the guys, along with Jim Braden. So when they tried to kill him on November 2 in Chicago, he was there. When they killed him in Dallas, on November 22, he was there. And when they killed his little brother 5 years later in LA, he was there. Now, I've outlined in red the prominent CIA, mafia, Cuban people that we've discussed. Now, the fact that all these names in these boxes have something in common, and it's Miami. Let's just go through it. I mean, all of these people were involved in the assassination, according to Fabian Escalante. All I did for the purposes of this series, because we're talking about Miami, is highlight the ones that have a Miami connection. And it's amazing how many of them. Start at the bottom with David Morales. He was a CIA assassin. William Harvey, we talked about him being in charge at JM Wave, Task Force W, Executive Actions, ZR Rifle, S-Force, Sheffield Edwards above him, the Nixon guy who was director of security for CIA, who went and met at the Fontainebleau when they put the S-Force together, Robert Mayhew, another CIA contact who met at the Fontainebleau to create the S-Force. Johnny Rosselli was the mob liaison with the CIA who met at the Fontainebleau to create the S-Force. Rip Robertson, the CIA guy, was a trainer of the S-Force operating out of Miami, would go down to Mexico and help train. Sam Giancana was in Miami when they put together the S-Force, as was Santos Trafficante in the middle there. Look at all these people and their relationship to Santos. I mean, he's the epicenter of this, right? He's the guy they have to go to get permission to carry out the original hit in Cuba. He's the guy that's going to supply the foot soldiers. They're all his people. That's why they call it the S-Force. Go down to the bottom, more CIA people. Martino was the guy on William Pauly's yacht who was ranting and raving. William Pauly tells him, don't worry, John, we're going to kill that motherfucker. He was on that yacht that left from Miami with the S-Force to kill Castro, even after Kennedy had said cease and desist. You got Bernard Barker at the bottom. He's one of the Cubans that was arrested after Watergate. He's from Miami. Herminio Diaz, according to what we just learned from Fabian Escalante, he was one of the shooters. He's from Miami. He's one of these anti-Castro Cubans. Jack Ruby. You said, what was Jack Ruby's Miami connection? Well, he went down to Miami when to fly out of there with Lee Harvey Oswald, according to witnesses, to get Santos Trafficante released from a Cuban jail after Castro put him in jail. Eladio Del Val, one of the Miami guys, one of the anti-Castro Cubans, who, according to Fabian Escalante, was a shooter. He was eventually killed in Miami during the Clay Shaw trial. Frank Sturgis operated out of JM Wave, a self-confessed CIA assassin. Tony Verona, Rolando Masfer, Carlos Priot. These are all big shot anti-Castro Cubans who are helping run anti-Castro or entities or organizations like the DRE or JUR, or Alpha 66, all out of Miami. I think you get the point. You've got CIA people in Miami, you got mafia people in Miami, you got Cuban exile people. They're all mixing and matching, and they're all there. The relationship is twisted and tortured, but it's there. And they're all there initially for the same purpose, which is to kill Castro or get rid of his government. But they, at some point, because of all the betrayals, turn on Kennedy and turn their operation that has been honed and trained and financed and armed and all this, and they turn that and they eliminate Kennedy instead. So It's a pretty interesting slide. Uh, the relationship here and how intertwined, how interdependent all these people are. Fabian Escalante continues, and he says that the instruments, and this is something that I've been maintaining throughout this series, is that it was these Cubans and these mafiosos who end up being the guys who do most of the dirty work. They're the useful instruments, mainly the Cubans. It was Santos Traficante's own foot soldiers who were trained by the CIA to carry out Operation 40 at Bay of Pigs. And Operation Zapata, these were mostly from the Cuban Revolutionary Council, this anti-Castro organization, that most of these guys were foot soldiers controlled and owned by Santos Traficante. So all of Operation 40, all of the sabotage, all of the propaganda, all of the armed incursions into Cuba were carried out by Santos's own people, his own foot soldiers. And when we get to Bay of Pigs, it's that paramilitary army of, again, Santos people, these Cuban foot soldiers who carried out. They're paramilitaries. Operation Mongoose, same thing. It's the same guys. S-Force. It's why we call it the S-Force. It's named after Santos Traficante. He goes smartly and recruits 15 of his own guys back from Operation 40/Operation Mongoose to create the S-Force. It's because they're being paid by the CIA, and he knows, I don't want them all on, if it goes bad, they're going to hang me out to dry, but they won't if it can be proven or traced back to them. And then you get to the assassination of JFK. It's the S-Force. Who's the S-Force? It's these same Cubans, these same foot soldiers from Santos Traficante's own army. And then you fast forward to 72, the Watergate burglars. The 4 of the 5 Cubans arrested at the Watergate were Cubans from Miami. This is how we learned this whole story in this flowchart, because Santos Traficante tells F. Lee Bailey, his law firm, and Danny Sheehan and the lawyers about how far back this goes. When they're asking about Watergate, he's saying, well, this actually goes back further than Watergate. This goes back to Operation 40. It's the same people involved in all of these things. And he tells them, listen, I was there at the beginning when they recruited my guys for Operation 40. I was there when they they sent my guys to Bay of Pigs. I was there when they re-upped the operation as Operation Mongoose, and it was my people that transitioned from Operation 40 to Operation Mongoose. It was my people they recruited. I recruited for the S-Force. The S-Force, because of the betrayals of JFK, turned, and instead of assassinating Castro, they assassinated JFK. It was my people. It was and you're asking me now about Watergate. It's the same people. Even the guy who's across the street gets arrested, E. Howard Hunt, the same guy that's been running Operation 40, Operation Zapata, Operation Mongoose, S-Force all along. Now he's in Watergate. It's the same people. These Cubans became useful instruments to this long, drawn-out covert. It wasn't one covert operation. It was a series of covert operations, which is why when you get to Watergate, Nixon was so paranoid about any honest investigation of Watergate, because he wasn't so worried about Watergate. He was worried about all of the other covert operations that he had his hand in, all going back to the days when he was vice president. And then the location, and this is why this is relevant to this series. Everything that we just discussed is based out of Miami. Operation 40 was based out of Miami. Bay of Pigs launched from Opelika Airport in Miami, South Florida. The Operation Mongoose Station was JM Wave, located on the South Campus, University of Miami. The S-Force was recruited from Operation 40, which was already based in Miami. And, of course, in that one particular case, when William Pauly took his yacht full of S-Force members to kill Castro, they took off from Biscayne Harbor in Miami. The assassination of JFK, all these S-Force recruits that were in Miami or in Dallas on the day JFK was killed, they're all S-Force recruits from Miami. The Watergate burglars, we've already established 4 of the 5 were Cubans from Miami. including Frank Sturgis. E. Howard Hunt was arrested. He was an actual boss. He was an Operation 40 and S-Force liaison, a boss at the Everglades base, which is right on the edge of Miami. It's all coming out of Miami. Sometimes I feel like I'm beating a dead horse, but it's so pivotal understanding what happened in Dallas. The afternoon after JFK had been killed, you just look at the reaction of Bobby Kennedy. You know, first thing he does is call Enrique Harry Ruiz Williams, who is a Bay of Pigs veteran, and he is Bobby's man inside the Cuban exile community down in Miami. He's his spy. He's the guy that gives him the heads up on everything. And he tells him, quote, one of your guys did it. And we have proof or evidence of that because there was somebody in the room when that phone conversation took place, and Harry Ruiz Williams repeated that quote from Bobby to this witness. And Bobby might as well have been saying one of our guys did it, because Bobby had been running Operation Mongoose from the White House in 61, and in an effort to take out Castro, had participated in this conspiracy, which eventually took out his brother. It's one of the reasons why Bobby was not so keen on a very honest investigation in the aftermath of his brother's death, because he realized immediately where it was going to lead. He had three suspects in his mind instantly: CIA, Mafia, Cuban exiles. He called the director of the CIA and says, come over to my house, I want to meet with you. And he challenged him, said, tell me you didn't do it. And of course, John McCone, who was the new director of the CIA, he had no knowledge of any of this because this was all he was out of the loop. But that was his first suspect. His second suspect was Mafia. He sent his own investigator to Chicago and Miami to investigate the mob. And the third one was the Cubans. This is why he made that phone call to Enrique Harry Ruiz Williams. And all of the above were operating out of a partnership in Miami. And who knew that better than anybody? Bobby Kennedy, because he was in charge of it. Until he wasn't. I just told you the little story about Santos Tropicante talking to the F. Lee Bailey law firm. And of course, their question was why? When they first sat down with him, their question was, well, why are 4 of the 5 guys Cubans from your area, from your territory? They're your people. So you obviously know something about these guys. Can you tell us the history? How are we going to defend James McCord, who was their client? Give us something that we can use to defend our client. And he says, well, there's more to the story. I don't know how much you want to know. And I've heard Daniel Sheehan talk a lot about this. And he was part of F. Lee Bailey's firm, recruited into F. Lee Bailey's law firm for the specific purpose of representing James McCord. So he was privy to this information. And he says, Santos has laid it out for him. Like I've been trying to lay out in 150 some odd episodes. Santos laid it out, and this is firsthand knowledge. He was there every step of the way. And when he gets done, he's talking about the S-Force and what happened in Dallas. He says, quote, they're the ones who killed the president. Which makes sense when you listen to the Nixon tapes, why he was so paranoid about any investigation of E. Howard Hunt, any investigation of Frank Sturgis, any investigation into Cubans. He was terrified where that would lead. And he was especially terrified of the check that they found in Bernard Barker's pocket, which led to that bank, the Banco Internacional down in Mexico City, which 12 years, 11 years, whatever prior had been paying the S-Force assassin team. Now it was paying the Watergate burglars. He did not want any investigation into that check or those $100 bills that were in the guy's pockets. And he says, this is why the S-Force guys killed the president. They were furious with JFK for betraying them when he mounted a military assault against them and their bases. That's those helicopter gunships he sent down with the customs officials, marshals, after promising them for years he would free Cuba. Now he turned on them. And now he's invading launching military assaults against their bases and arresting their leaders. He betrayed them. And who would know better than Santos Trafficante about those betrayals, history of these Cuban refugees, these exiles who have been in these various anti-Castro causes all this time, which later turned become an anti-Kennedy cause. Who knows better than Santos? I want to throw this in as well. This really doesn't have anything to do with Miami necessarily, but the mafia, and again, these are FBI wiretaps that prove again that J. Edgar Hoover had prior knowledge. He had foreknowledge what was fixing to happen because of these FBI wiretaps. By this point in time, Jimmy Hoffa, who's closely allied with all these mafiosos, is in prison. And so the only way he can communicate with these mafiosos is through his attorney, Regano, who comes and visits him and then goes back, takes the messages to Carlos Marcello, Santos Trafficante. Well, they got everything bugged. And Regano goes back to Carlos Marcello, Santos Trafficante, with a message from Jimmy Hoffa. And he says, "You won't believe what Hoffa wants me to tell you." He's talking to his bosses. "Jimmy wants you to kill the president." So they're wiretapping all these conversations between Hoffa and Regano, and between Regano and Marcello and Santos Trafficante. So when Regano goes back to Hoffa, Hoffa tells Regano, quote, this is subsequent to that earlier conversation, "I told you they could do it." This is after the assassination. "I'll never forget what Carlos and Santos did for me. This means Bobby is out as Attorney General." And this is that famous photo of well, Jimmy Hoffa hated Bobby Kennedy, but he understood. And this is during one of the hearings where Bobby's giving him hell, and it's on camera. And this is Jimmy's Hoffa's way of nonverbal communication with Bobby. They actually had a grudging respect for each other, believe it or not. You know, Jimmy was tough, Bobby was tough, and they sort of had a respect for each other. But Bobby was determined to put Jimmy Hoffa away in prison, and he won. And so Jimmy wants revenge, but he knows, just like Carlos Marcello said, if you cut off the tail, the dog will continue to be a problem. If you cut off the head, the dog is no longer a problem. And they both understood if you kill Bobby first, JFK is still the president. He will move heaven and earth against you in revenge. But if you kill JFK, Bobby is neutered. The new president probably won't keep him as Attorney General. And he'll be so racked with guilt because he knows it was his people that were the anti-Castros that eventually killed his own people, killed his own brother, that he'll probably shut down, which is exactly what he did. He shut down after the assassination. Carlos Marcello famously told a wired up FBI informant. So this is not just based on the testimony of Jack Van Lanningham. The FBI has the tape to prove it. Then on December 15th, 1987, Carlos Marcello, who eventually ends up in prison, tells his cellmate, "Yeah, I had the son of a bitch killed. I'm glad I did. I'm sorry I couldn't have done it myself." This is a famous picture here. November 22, 1963, right after Marcello wins a court battle against Bobby in the Justice Department. He's walking away from the courthouse, ready to go celebrate, and he's just getting the news that JFK has been assassinated in Dallas. So this is Marcello's big day for two reasons. And of course, the reason I'm bringing up this mafioso involvement is because I've been maintaining since the beginning that there's 5 conspirators. There's the Cubans, the mob, the CIA, and then you got the Secret Service, and you got LBJ. And I've tried to be really careful to show how 3 of those have connections to Miami. And the 3 were, because this is a Miami series, the 3 were CIA, mob, and the Cubans. And so I'm showing you these mafiosos who I have stipulated through Santos Trafficante have a connection to Miami, and through these conversations proving the mafia had a role to play in this. And of course, what's key or who's key in this is Santos Trafficante, because he's the Miami mafioso. But anyway, find my cursor here. There was even, and I've talked about different predictions of this happening and how J. Edgar Hoover had foreknowledge, people in Madrid had foreknowledge, and people all around the country had foreknowledge that this was happening. One of this, and I will talk about this event more in the next mini-series about the Miami Mole, is another FBI informant named William Somerset, who has a conversation with a member of the White Citizens Council out of Georgia. But they're talking in Miami. This is on November 15th, 1963. And the guy's name is Joseph Miltier. He's pictured at the top here. And on November 5th, this is regarding JFK's trip to Miami on November 18th. So 3 days prior to JFK's trip to Miami, a memo from a Miami detective named S.J. Hebert about receiving a phone call from a Secret Service agent named Agent Jameson. So he takes down notes about this phone call. And Agent Jameson is calling and saying, I want to talk to William Somerset because I heard he has some interesting information for us. And Somerset had this conversation with Joseph Miltier on November 5th, 1963. So see if I get these dates right. November 15th is when the phone call comes in to Miami detective from the Secret Service. And it's in anticipation or in preparation for 3 days later, JFK coming to Miami. He says, I need to talk to this informant who had a conversation with somebody down your way in Miami on November 5th, 1963. So anyway, they have the conversation. Somerset forwards on to the Secret Service that Miltier told him that Kennedy was a, quote, marked man. And this is interesting because the Secret Service has always claimed that they didn't have any prior knowledge of a plot to kill Kennedy. And they tried to disavow what happened in Chicago on November 2. They tried to disavow what happened in Miami on the 18th, and Tampa and all these different places, and just pretend like they just had a bad day on November 22 in Dallas. But they had all kinds of advanced knowledge. And not just them, but the FBI. And so anyway, Miltier tells Somerset Kennedy was a marked man. When Somerset asked him how would something like this happen, Miltier predicted eerily correctly that it would happen, quote, from an office building with a high-powered rifle. Now, this was on November 5th. 13 days later, Kennedy is scheduled to come to Miami, and he is scheduled to land at an airport and motorcade through Miami past tall office buildings, just like Dallas, on his way to the convention center to give a speech. Now, there is no record that this warning from Miltier to Somerset to Hebert to Agent Jameson and the Secret Service is the reason the logistics of the trip all got changed, because this information did not come out after the assassination from the Secret Service. The Secret Service pretended like this, they denied this. They denied ever having any knowledge of this. And there's no record of this ever making it into the Secret Service pre-planning of anything, whether it be Miami or Dallas or anyone. I mean, they clearly didn't, because 4 days later, after they went to Miami, 4 days later, they go to Dallas and they motorcade through the Dallas past tall office buildings, and he indeed gets shot from an office building with a high-powered rifle. So if you claim that this is the reason you changed your logistics when you came to Miami, then you have to ask the question, well, why didn't continue to make those changes when he went to Dallas? He predicted exactly how it would go down, and you allowed it to happen. So you can't claim that you took precautions in Miami and then say that you had no knowledge of it when it came to Dallas. It's either you knew in advance and you took precautions in both cases, or you didn't know which is why you didn't take precautions. So the Secret Service claims it didn't know, which means this warning never made it up the chain. But this guy Miltier correctly predicted exactly how the assassination would go down. There's another reason why they took why the logistics were changed in Miami, which we'll talk about in the next miniseries, but it doesn't have anything to do with this interaction here between the FBI informant and the Secret Service. By the way, this bottom picture here, we don't know for sure. Miltier, you see the red arrow, and you see the JFK limo as it approaches. This is in Dallas, right before the shooting. It looks a lot like Miltier. People have gone through, JFK researchers have gone through every photo of all the crowd and everybody and tried to identify everyone who was there. And there's a lot of suspicion that that is Joseph Miltier watching, because he knows it's fixing to go down. I told you earlier in this same video that a lot of people were there that weren't involved in the assassination, but had suspicious ties and or backgrounds, and had heard through the rumor mill that this was going down and wanted to be there and have a front row seat to watch it happen. And the suspicion is that Joseph Miltier is one of these people. Like I said, I don't know if that's him or not, but it's been speculated that it was. All right. I wanted to finish this series with something that comes from Nixon, because remember, I have maintained from the get-go that Nixon set all this in action, all this in motion, not intentionally. He didn't create the S-Force to kill Kennedy. Okay, he was running against Kennedy in 1960 when he created the S-Force, but his intention was not for the S-Force to go kill Kennedy. His intention was to win the 60 election by getting Castro killed, but then he lost, and by losing, he lost control or jurisdiction over the S-Force, the CIA, and all these things going forward for a period of time, for 8 years. Somebody else was in charge, and that S-Force, through the actions of Kennedy himself and the betrayals, turned on their own and with help from their higher ups and deemed the new threat to be Kennedy and took him out instead. But Nixon knew who did it, and he knew any investigation of the S-Force would eventually lead back to how it was created. And of course, who created it? It was him. And his political career would not survive that. You can't have any hand in the assassination of your political opponent and it come out to the American people and you survive, at least not politically. So he's going to, after Watergate, that is what he's so afraid is going to come out. And the way we know that is several ways. First of all, the tapes, what he says in the tapes. But there's another interaction between him and the CIA director, Richard Helms, that takes place right after he becomes president. In fact, it's one of the first things he does. This is right after he wins the presidency in 1968. This has been weighing on his mind. Okay, just imagine, I'm president. I made it. Now I can get rid of all this evidence that ties me to the assassination of JFK. So in 1969, just after he takes the oath, he assigns John Ehrlichman from the White House to go to the CIA and get the entire Bay of Pigs file from CIA Director Richard Helms. Now, that's what he's calling it, the Bay of Pigs file. Now, you remember now the code that it's discovered in the Watergate hearings. Whenever Richard Nixon refers to the Bay of Pigs, he's talking about the JFK assassination. Or the Bay of Pigs guys, he's talking about his S-Force. For 3 years, Ehrlichman tried to get that file out of CIA Director Richard Helms. The entire file. He wanted the whole thing, which is all of the covert stuff, all the anti-Castro, all the Operation 40 stuff. He wants it all that leads up to the Bay of Pigs and even the subsequent investigation, how it failed afterwards. He wants the whole thing. So fast forward to September 1971. For 3 years, Ehrlichman's been coming up empty. So Ehrlichman finally goes to Nixon, who's probably frustrated beyond belief by this point. And he tells him, listen, he's not going to give it to me. He's only going to give it to you in person. These are documents. There are documents that back up this evidence. So a month later, Nixon meets Helms at the White House. This is October of 71. And this is first and foremost on Nixon's mind. And this is a picture of that meeting. So Helms is on the left, Nixon's on the right. At this White House meeting, and this is recorded on tapes. This is 8 months before Watergate. Nixon tells Helms the same thing Ehrlichman's been telling. He says, I want that Bay of Pigs file. I want the entire thing. And Helms replies back hesitantly because he says, you understand this file is hundreds of thousands of pages. It's a monster. All these coverts, all of the Bay of Pigs stuff the CIA has been involved in, all these different operations that we've been talking about, it's in one big file. He's calling it the Bay of Pigs file, but it's all the covert anti-Castro stuff. And he says, this thing's hundreds of thousands of pages. So Nixon replies, quote, I understand the dirty tricks part of it. I know what you, the CIA, did in Iran. Obviously, he would know because he was over the 5412 committee in 53. I know what you, the CIA, did in Guatemala. Obviously, he would know because he was vice president over the 5412 committee in 1954. And he goes, I know what you, the CIA, tried to do at the Bay of Pigs. It was a good plan, but Kennedy just didn't follow up. And in the tape, Helms is puzzled, like he's trying to figure out where Nixon's going with this. And finally, Nixon leans in. He says, I need it for a negotiation. I really need it for the who shot John angle. In other words, he's asking for this Bay of Pigs file, not for all of this, what happened in Iran and Guatemala and even Bay of Pigs. The only thing he really wants it for is he wants to, there's information in there about who shot John that Nixon knows is important or is incriminating to him. And he wants to get rid of it. He wants to know what's in that file. When you fast forward to Watergate, the essence of that whole spying operation was he wanted to know what the director of the DNC knew about, again, the S-Force and his involvement in creating the S-Force and how it could be used against him in the 72 campaign. Nixon was obsessed with knowing what other people knew and could use against him. He had to know so that he could come up with a defense or whatever. I don't think he was trying to destroy evidence necessarily. I think he just wanted to know what other people knew and could use against him. It's the explanation given, the political explanation given for Watergate, and it explains this whole interaction between him and CIA Director Richard Helms. The Bay of Pigs file, which we already know in his mind means JFK assassination. He's obsessed with it. And he's for 8 years been stewing about what he knew, how that went down and who that leads back to. Now he finally has a shot to get his hands on that information. And it's all about, as he explains to Helms, I don't really care about the dirty tricks. I understand all that. I was part of it. Iran, Guatemala, Bay of Pigs. That's not what I want it for. I want it for the, quote, who shot John angle. Of course, he's talking about Kennedy. And that, in conjunction with what he said in the tapes that came out later, proves to me at least that Nixon, who set all this in motion, and if you go back to his original motive, it was because Castro would not agree to his terms, how he was going to rule in Cuba. And Nixon had investments in Cuba through Bibi Rebozo, and he wanted to protect those investments. He had ties to organized crime. They wanted back into Cuba. They wanted rid of Castro. So I think he went to Eisenhower and he pushed all this anti-Castro stuff. And to win the election, he pushed for the S-Force to be created. And it got out of hand. It got out of control. He had a tiger by the tail. And when he was no longer in a position to have a tiger by the tail, he didn't have his hand on the tail anymore. It got out of control, went rogue, did its own thing. And now he's back and he's trying to put that tiger back in the cage. And for 3 years, he tried to get that file out of Helms. And when Helms finally found out why, it was because he was obsessing about who shot John and how that information in there could be used. He wanted to know what information was in there that could be used against him. In Nixon's own words, as we learn later from Bob Haldeman, Bay of Pigs always meant JFK assassination. So whenever he's talking about Bay of Pigs, he's talking about JFK assassination, including here. And when he talks about Bay of Pigs guys, he's talking about the guys who shot John. And we already know who that was. That was the S-Force. And who created the S-Force? Richard Milhouse Nixon. Now, by the time he got what Helms gave him, it was a heavily redacted version of the file. It had been scrubbed clean. And he knew it had been scrubbed clean. He knew what should have been in there, and he knew it wasn't there. It had been either redacted or taken out. And so it was at this point that Nixon believed the CIA was against him. And that leads to a whole new set of problems, which is if I can't get the CIA to give me the information that I'm asking for, if I can't get J. Edgar Hoover and the FBI to do my bidding, that's what happened. When he couldn't get the CIA to cooperate, he went to FBI Director J. Edgar Hoover, and J. Edgar Hoover just ignored him. And so because of those obstacles he kept running into, first from the CIA and then from the FBI, he created his own plumbers unit, his own special investigative unit that he would have control over, that would be independent of any government agency. That would be working directly for him, for the White House, and they would take their orders from him because he was frustrated. It took him 3 years to get the copy of the file, and he turns out it wasn't even the full file. And he went to FBI Director J. Edgar Hoover, who ignored him. And so he said, screw all of you. I will create my own special investigative unit. And that eventually led to Watergate. So if you extrapolate this out, the whole anti-Castro thing came from Nixon back in 1959. And he went to Eisenhower, and he pushed it on Eisenhower, and Eisenhower's thinking it was I'm about done. He's probably going to be the next president anyway. Let him deal with it. So he gave him what he wanted. And then to win the election, he got that S-Force created. He's already got Operation 40 in gear running. Now he's got the S-Force running, and then he loses the election. It spins out of control. Kennedy gets killed. He doesn't win the election until 1968. In 1968, first thing he does is go back, try to get that file of all that hanky-panky that he started in motion back in 1959. And for 3 years, he tries and tries. He can't get it. Helms finally gives him a redacted version, but it's leaving out all the important parts. And Nixon is the only one who would know what's missing from that. He knows. And now he's, okay, the CIA's, they're plotting against me. And that was another thing about Nixon. He was paranoid, and he had this hyper sense of paranoia, which always made him think that everyone was out to get him. And so then when he goes to J. Edgar Hoover, and Hoover doesn't pay him any mind, he says, okay, I guess I'm going to have to handle this myself. And he creates this plumbers unit, which eventually leads to Watergate. And now what happened at Watergate is not the story that we've been told, is not exactly the story it's not even close to the story that actually happened, because the CIA is going to find out what he's doing, and they're going to infiltrate the plumbers. They're going to infiltrate the White House. They're going to infiltrate the committee to reelect the president. And they're going to use that to put the screws to Nixon when it becomes obvious that he has become a problem, just like Kennedy had become a problem. Isn't this amazing how you go back to 1958, 1959, when all this stuff happened in Cuba, how it's all connected and one event leads to another, and they're all related to each other. And you finally get to Watergate, and what we're told about Watergate is that Nixon was trying to win an election in 1972. And that's why he did what he did. Has nothing to do with that. Has everything to do with trying to cover up what he did in 1959. And the CIA was able to use used Nixon's own impulses, used Nixon's own paranoia against him, knowing he would take the bait, which he did, and walk right into a trap, which he did. And where does all this lead back to? When you get right back down to the root of it, it all leads back to the city of Miami. Up to and including the Watergate burglars, 4 of the 5 were from Miami. And the guy who spilled the beans on all of this, Santos Trafficante, was the mob boss from Miami. It all leads back to Miami. And of course, who was Nixon's guy in Miami? It was Bibi Rabosa. So what a story. I hope I explained it in a way that is easily understood. When it comes to history and my role as a teacher, I always felt like it was my job not to get all the content 100% correct. I do my best, but to create an interest, to be a hook, so to speak. Kind of reminds me of that scene in Mr. Holland's Opus, and he's using rock and roll music back during the 50s to try to get his students interested in band and in music. And he gets called into the office before the Board of Education because back then, 50s rock was scandalous. And they thought it was the devil's music, all this kind of thing. He goes, I'll use any kind of music as a hook, as some way to get my kids interested in music. They wanted him to use classical music and big band, all that kind of stuff. He says, they're not interested in that. The kids of today are not interested in that. So I'm using speaking their language, I'm using what is interesting to them to try to get them interested in a larger topic, which is music in general. The JFK assassination, Watergate scandal, all this Cold War intrigue is just it's what is interesting to me. And so I try to use it as a hook to get people who listen to be interested in history in general, to understand that history does not happen in a vacuum. There's always a cause and effect. There's a trickle down. It's like that, throw the rock in the pond and the ripples out. It has a lot of far-reaching effects on other people and other events that seemingly are unrelated. You study them long enough, you find out they're not unrelated. On a side note, I wanted to add this. A listener brought this to my attention, and it was a very good point. I did not, in episode 5, I was talking about Marita Lorenz, and I did not talk in that episode clearly enough about what I thought about her testimony that she met Lee Harvey Oswald at the Everglades base. And she included those 2 pictures, which I did mention didn't look like Oswald. And that was my way of saying I didn't think it was Oswald. And I don't think it was Oswald. I think it was another Oswald doppelganger. But he introduced himself to Marita Lorenz and everybody there as Lee Harvey Oswald, as all these doppelgangers were doing at that time, as another way to sheep dip him and incriminate him with all this evidence that was going to lead back to things that would show him to be a pro-Castro or whatever, the patsy in the assassination. So again, I just want to stipulate, I believe Marita Lorenz, when she said she met Lee Harvey Oswald in 60, and then later again in 63 at the Everglades base, and then they traveled together that night to Dallas, the trunk full of weapons. I believe it was a doppelganger claiming to be Lee Harvey Oswald, and that Marita Lorenz believed it. And later, after the assassination, went to the authorities and said, hey, I was with this guy, just like all these other people who ran into Oswald doppelgangers. The resemblance was so good, so close, that it fooled people into thinking that they had actually met Lee Harvey Oswald. And Marita Lorenz was one of those. It doesn't diminish the rest of her story. All these people who ran into these doppelgangers who thought they ran into Lee Harvey Oswald were telling the truth. As far as they knew it, it was Lee Harvey Oswald. It wasn't them who lied. It was the doppelganger who lied to them. And it was part of the setup. And so I believe that was a doppelganger in the car with her, a doppelganger at Everglades. That picture, as you can see, he's tall, he's thin. He doesn't look like Oswald. And but she thought it was. So there you see that the doppelganger And I showed that in those episodes I did with the doppelgangers, going all the way back to 59 and 60 when he was in Russia. They already had doppelgangers running around pretending to be him. So it's right during that same time frame. So it makes complete sense that this was a doppelganger. Okay, that was a lot. That was a long one today, but that concludes my Miami series, at least as far as the conspiracy town is concerned. Keep a watch out for the next two episodes, which will be entitled The Mole from Miami. And this will be a story of someone who, again, I was alerted to by a listener and a little bit of research. And wow, what an interesting story came from that as to why the two assassination plots on November 18th did not succeed in Miami. The reason it didn't succeed is there was a person there who was watching JFK's back. And we'll talk about that later. Until then, hope everybody has a great day. Thanks. God bless.